Anyhow, my name is Samuelson Brown. My talk tonight is coming out of this book, The Bad Old Days of Colorado, which was a finalist in the Colorado Book Awards for nonfiction. So thanks for that. It was like, wow. It's like I got street cred now, finally. So Candace came up, or maybe I came up with this title, of Drinking, Dancing, Debauchery in Colorado Mining Town. So this one isn't so much this area, just general wild Colorado behavior. And there's a surprise scourge in Colorado history that you guys probably don't know about, but you will by the end of the evening. Okay, so as everybody knows who knows me, my basic premise is that Colorado was not settled by temperate, well-adjusted people. So we're just going to start there. Okay, so one of the things, some of you might have read my other book, The Beaten Territory, which went on to be paperback and is now called Market Street Madam, which confuses me hopelessly. But I did take the research I was doing for prostitution for that book, and this started this book here, where I met the Bonnefields in Billings, Montana. They had editors and agents there, and I was just kind of being like I normally am. And this woman named Erin Turner said, "You, who are you and where are you from?" And I'm like, "I'm from Colorado. We're bad and proud of it." And she's like, "I want to talk to you." So she signed me for this book. And so this book involved a lot of research. And one of the basic premises that I was wondering about as I started down this path is, what are myths in Colorado history that we all just keep repeating because we've heard it so many times that we think it's true? Okay? And some of it is, some of it isn't. But one of the things that I always grew up hearing is there were so many more men in Colorado than women. So I'm like, okay, what does that mean? So here are your statistics. Colorado's first census, 1860, 32,654 people. Of that, 31,077 were men. Okay, so that one seems like a fairly real thing here. I looked at the females, the overall ratio. With those females of 1577, some of those were babies, small children. Those are not necessarily full-grown women, okay? They are female. Okay, so that ratio is 20 to 1. So then when you start digging deeper, if you look at men aged 20 to 30, there were 17,604 of those guys, and there were 520 females in that same age group. So we kind of see what the problem is, right? So a lot of those, that 34 ratio, 34 to 1, men aged 30 to 40 that same year, 10,511 to 278 women. That's a ratio of 38 to 1. Okay, so all that together kind of gives you an idea this was a very male-dominated society, right? There were probably a few nice women, proper women, but these were the days when the railroad wasn't coming out here yet. You had to go on a wagon train. Wagon trains were not easy. It was not like the movies, especially coming out this way. So just keep that in mind. So we had a saloon culture in Colorado that seems to still be alive and well, living right in the same state. So that's always good. Here's a picture of cowboys in a Morrison bar. So I'm from Golden originally. Morrison was like the next town down. So these are just some cow hands, like having beer or whatever they're having. Okay, probably some of you have seen the lectures before, have seen the slide, but it's just still fun. Watered down whiskey is really what you would buy in most saloons, okay? Then you read it's $25 a shot, and you kind of think, well, big deal, that's pretty cheap. Well, when you look at today's dollars versus the price then, that's like $7 a shot. So all of a sudden it's not that cheap, right? So people would water down the whiskey because they came in barrels, right? And didn't take long for people to figure out that if you put some water to it, that barrel lasted longer, okay? So, but they also would put horrible stuff in it. So, bogus whiskey was made with raw ethyl alcohol. They could put in tobacco juice, gunpowder, prune juice, tree bark, molasses, sagebrush, strychnine, turpentine, creosote, and rattlesnake heads. These were like kind of known as common ingredients in early drinking patterns in Colorado. Here's a good picture from Cripple Creek. This is the Colorado liquor house, sorry, not horse, house. So here's just a famous picture of it. So a story about whiskey. Whiskey was often made, this is coming from a guy, Robert Kirkpatrick, back in 1863, so this is a contemporary source. Whiskey was often made with 2 barrels of water and a few plugs of tobacco with a quantity of camphor, which wasn't in the first slide, okay, and a little strychnine to give it a tang, to 1 barrel of pure whiskey, which made 3 barrels of what they were calling red-eye, okay? When the 40 rod, this is what he's talking about, I think they had some measuring stick, got near the bottom of the barrel, it was so dangerous that a man sometimes dropped dead from the effects of a few glasses of whiskey having too much tang near the bottom of the barrel. Okay? So when we're looking at old Western names in Colorado for liquor, we got Scamper Juice, Base Burner, Bottled Courage, which was whiskey, bug juice, Calabogus, which was rum and spruce beer, Clinch Mountain was rye whiskey, Coffin Varnish, self-explanatory, Corn Juice was whiskey, Cowboy Cocktail was straight whiskey, so I don't really know what their differentials are there, and I'm kind of afraid to ask. Dead Shot, Dynamite, Family Disturbance, Fire Water, and 40 Rod. So we saw the 40 Rod story right there. So when Denver was like a fledgling little settlement, the first Christmas we had a character named Uncle Dick Wooten come into town. Dick Wooten had the Raton Pass, the toll road on Raton Pass, but he was coming up to Denver to trade, and he brought with him something called Taos whiskey, okay? Everybody, from what I can tell, mainly men as we see, everybody was drinking this Taos whiskey, and the newspaper said everybody got so drunk, the entire camp was hilarious, and nobody felt real good the next morning. So when we're looking at masculine pastimes, and the Leadville vampires, okay, and you're going to just be like, what the hell is she talking about? But and the Leadville vampires, and other forms of wagers and means of losing hard-earned money. Okay, so these guys, they're all coming to Denver, they're dispersing out to whatever gold camp they're going to. There's a gazillion of them, to the women available. They start to gamble. Go surprise. They gamble and they drink, right? So people were betting on pretty much anything. One early account from Livius Barney, who was, I guess you'd call him a correspondent for a newspaper back east. I don't know if he was paid to do this or he was just simply writing to this newspaper telling them how bad things were out here. But he said men would actually bet on how long it would take to roast a steer in a barbecue. You know, just like they were that bored. Actually, you know, living in a gold camp was really hard. Starvation, hunger was actually a real thing. A lot of people went through the supplies they brought back east, and when they got out here with all the shipping costs and the scarcity, their prices were much higher out here than they expected. And so hunger actually was an issue. So, but anyhow, I don't think that stopped anybody from drinking or gambling. And that makes me sound like a mother. It's like, like, what are you doing? Here's a picture of a Leadville gambling parlor. So, you see people just going ahead gambling, which is fun. We have lots of gambling pictures at the Denver Public Library. They are fun to look at. Gambling was known as bucking the tiger, which is a wonderfully poetic name. I just love that name. In Leadville, if you want to take an example of one of the most notorious gold camps we had, the one side going north was, in the alley, was called Tiger Alley, and they had like a lot of illicit games like back behind the saloons and the brothels and all this type of thing. And on the other side going south was known as Stillborn Alley, and that's actually where they performed a lot of abortions and stuff like that. So it kind of gives you an idea that State Street wasn't maybe the nicest neighborhood we had going. But anyhow, Pharaoh was the king of all the games. That was played with a single deck of cards. I don't think it's like what we see in Las Vegas now, or when I was there and people are doing Pharaoh stuff. They had roulette, poker, chuck-a-luck, which was 3 dice and something that looked like a bird cage. Now, I was in an antique store in South Dakota, and I'm still kind of kicking myself, because I think I found this chuck-a-luck thing, right? You know, so it's kind of like an hourglass thing with like a cage. But it was like $98, and I'm like, I just don't know, because I was like, I could take this to places and show them this, but I wasn't really sure that's what it was, and so I didn't want to have somebody go, that's from a church basement bingo game. So I just like left it where it was. But anyhow, and then there were various shell games, including Soapy Smith's money-laden soap bars. So Soapy Smith was a Denver character. He also went around to mining camps. I think he went down to Creed. I know he was up in Leadville. He actually ended up murdered up in Alaska. I think it was Skagway. Somebody saying, yep. Cool. So what he would do is he would like bury or have form soap around money pieces, like a $5 gold piece. And if people were wanting to gamble and they were going to take their chances, you know, they would like do whatever they do, and the person would pay their money and they get the bar of soap, and it wouldn't have a gold piece in it. So if nobody was really falling to this, they would have shills out in the group, a friend of Soapy's, who would like, you know, do whatever the bet was, miraculously get this $5 gold piece of bar of soap. Soapy made a lot of money doing this. In Colorado's People's Defense in those days, where he played these games was like in a heavily salooned area, so I'm hoping everybody had been drinking, okay, because otherwise it's just kind of sad. And then they had what I found so amazing. I guess I'd heard rumors of these people, but what was considered the scourge of Colorado, and these were people, men, who were known as foot racers. This is a Telluride and unnamed saloon, I think. Kind of looks like the cover of my book, but I didn't do that intentionally, but I don't know. Here is a picture of the J.F. Bates Hose Running Company. Now, these guys have striped socks. They kind of have like onesies or unitards on. All the women thought these were the wildest guys, I don't know, this side of the Mississippi, right? And so they would work for hose companies, which were the early fire departments. Okay, so one guy, oh God, one of them in there, I think, golly. One of these guys, I'm not sure which, so I don't want to point out the wrong guy, maybe it's in here, but his name is Cortez Thompson, okay? So Cortez Thompson started out in Georgetown, and I have a whole section of this. It's kind of a small section of this in the book, but he worked for one of the fire companies. Let's see, Court is seated in the second row on the left. Okay. So I think that little guy sitting down there, okay, he was the love interest of Maddie Silks, one of the most infamous madams in Denver. Somehow, the story goes, they met up in Georgetown. Court may or may not have been married to somebody, may or may not have had a daughter. Maddie may or may not have been married to somebody. Nobody really kind of knows. But she fell madly in love with Court Thompson, foot racers, striped types, and unitard. Okay. So what the foot racers used to do is when they weren't fighting fires or they weren't training, they would have foot races. Again, back to the gambling. So you could bet on the foot racers. And the only problem was there was a group of them who were pretty dishonest. And what they would do is they'd go around to other Colorado mountain towns, sign up for these foot races, collect bets. Somebody who looked neutral, would collect all these bets. The race would be won or lost or whatever was supposed to happen, and a lot of times the money would just simply disappear. So, if you look in the old newspapers, people were plenty peeved about these foot racers. They were called the scourge of the earth. They wanted to send them back to wherever they came from. They were just awful, according to the mores of the time. So here's another picture. This is the Alert Hose Company in Central City, Colorado. I gotta say the Denver group to me looks a little bit better, but that's okay. But here's Central City. And so when I was working on this book, I was up in Georgetown and I was just like talking to people, and this one guy with white hair came up to me and, he's like, we used to have these hose companies up here. And I'm like, oh yeah, you guys did great because Georgetown is one of the few towns of the early mining camps that actually did not burn down. And the reason why their architecture is so good, so many of the silver barons would have houses there, and they paid a lot of money to have those hose companies established, right? So that their town wouldn't burn down, they wouldn't lose all their investments, right? So this guy is like, well, so I'm selling this book on prostitutes, right? The beaten territory, great. And he's like, well, can I tell you a kind of off-colored story? And I'm like, sure you can, no problem. What do you got for me? And he's like, well, now, I think this had to be true because my father told me or his grandfather told him. So I'm just kind of smiling and listening. He's like, well, where like the red light section in town is? And I'm like, yeah, back over there. He's like, right. And so there was this foot racer, and I'm like, yes. And he's like going, well, a prostitute bet him $100 that she could beat him in a foot race. She was drunk at the time she made this bet. The guy takes the bet, and there's a lot of witnesses around. Okay, fine. So the plan is the next day at noon, they're going to meet in front of this brothel, and this foot race is going to kick off, right? And so everybody's fine, and it's Georgetown, so people kind of assemble. They want to see what's going to happen. So the foot racer, one of these guys, comes there and he's waiting, and she doesn't show. And he's looking at his watch, doesn't show. And he's like, well, do I get my $100? And everybody's like, well, not yet, give her a minute, it doesn't show, it's getting a little bit later. Can I have my $100? And then somebody thinks, well, yeah, you can have your $100, but you got to run for it. So we're not just going to hand you $100 because this drunk woman defaulted. So they decide, they're going on your mark, get set, and the pistol goes off, and the woman comes flying out of the brothel completely naked and runs right on past him, and everybody was so stunned she won the bet. That story, the old guy, and I'm like, oh my God, can I use this? How can I use this story? And he's like, but I think it really had to be true because my father, whoever, told me. And I'm like, yeah, I believe you. I believe nobody is going to make up something like that. But I do love that story. So, Cortez Thompson and Maddie Silk, really star-crossed lovers of a very strange variety. Cort was probably one of the worst gamblers Colorado has ever seen, and I don't mean worst as in how much money he was gambling. I mean how poorly he was gambling. So, Ed Chase wouldn't let him in his place because he liked Maddie Silks, and he couldn't stand to watch him gambling her hard-earned money so unskillfully, so he wouldn't let him in. Other places were not so kind. Cort made a friend, I think actually was some guy from up in this area who came down to Denver for whatever purpose, made friends with them. The guy had really a fairly large sum of money with him. Cort takes him to kind of a bad saloon and gets the guy really, really drunk, and the guy's money all disappears. Go figure, it's Denver. But that was like Cort's whole persona. So people would really see him coming, and even people along Market Street, which is our red light district. He was kind of seen really, I mean, in a sea of ill repute, he was kind of seen as like really not cool, you know, so that's actually saying something. Maddie Silk got in a duel with another madam. They said, the newspapers, okay, so the newspapers at the time were not like what we think of the Rocky Mountain News, which is defunct, or the Denver Post today, where we kind of think we get objective coverage. These were kind of more like the National Enquirer. They were like really writing for entertainment, and so, you know, there was a duel, maybe by Spear Boulevard now, between Maddie and these two people, Maddie and this other madam. The newspaper said the women were bare-chested and they had sabers and they were pacing off. It just depends what account you do. I don't think the women were bare-chested. I think they had all their clothes on. But it turns out Maddie was a really bad shot, so she took a shot at her opponent and somehow it ricocheted off of something and hit Court Thompson in the ear. So that was kind of good, and like the town thought that was all just fine and nice and wonderful. So here's just like a really interesting group that I thought I found, you know, when I was doing the research, just because I had not heard of the scourge of Colorado foot racers. Here is not the last hanging, but a hanging in Leadville, Colorado. This is from Francis Gilbert and Merrick Rosenbrand. You can see two bodies at the distance. They had another double hanging coming later on. I think maybe that one was 1887. But this was also seen as a form of entertainment. So you see all these people, it's really a sea of people. So I think they probably had maybe 1,000 people in attendance at the time for this double hanging. Francis Gilbert was some sort of, you call them lot jumpers now. So what would happen is you would come into a gold town if the gold strike hadn't really happened. You'd buy up some land for cheap. Maybe you sold it, you know, to somebody for what seemed like a lot of money. Then they had a big strike. Then you'd want the land back. So if you somehow didn't quite make the transaction go smoothly, you could like say, oh, but I never sold it. I don't have the document. He didn't sign it. All this type of stuff. So he was an infamous lot jumper. Now, I can't even remember what Merrick Rosenkrantz did. I think he shot a guy in self-defense, or he said it was self-defense, but that might have been the third time that happened. So they were in jail, and they were supposed to be probably handled normally, but people did go in, busted them out of jail, and this is what happened. And this is a photo in the Denver Public Library. So to me, it's kind of astounding that people wanted to see people hang, but there you go. So then, my specialty, which I always talk about, and everybody's like, oh God, and my mother's family is like going, I don't understand why she's talking about these things. Feminine company in Colorado in the early days, especially before the railroads came into making it easier for families to come out west and join their husbands, brothers, whatever you had out here. Feminine company were probably, well, they were a rarity, right? You know, we all know the story about like Silver Heels. I was talking at the Aurora Museum, and some woman swore her grandmother knew who Silver Heels was. I don't know, is that a Colorado legend or is it real? I don't know, and I haven't really gone in that deep, but for those of you who don't, does anybody not know about Silver Heels? Okay, so Silver Heels, okay, does everybody know where Fairplay, Colorado is? Okay, so Fairplay. Before there was Fairplay, there was a place called Buckskin Joe. And Buckskin Joe was a little bit past Alma, going further back in. Okay, so in the early days of Colorado history, same as the West, likely the same as New York City, pandemics were really a problem. And so if there was something going on, it would spread through the community. With this legend of Silver Heels, it was said that it was a smallpox outbreak. And so In cases that I found documented, so this part is true later on with like later accounts and later newspapers, a lot of prostitutes did actually help nurse minors or nurse the community as best they could back to health in times of severe need. So the smallpox epidemic was one of those severe needs. In Buckskin Joe, there was a lovely prostitute named Silver Heels, known because her heel boots were silver. She nursed the miners back to health. They say that the miners took up a collection for her services, which she turned down, just like as a matter of principle. But somewhere along the line, the story goes, she contracted smallpox herself. So she went into a cabin and she survived. But the smallpox left pits in her face, marring her beauty, and I guess she must have been like a fairly, she was proud of her looks before that point. And so she just wore a very dark veil after that, and she left. One point she just left. And so when the miners went to see, I think the story goes like on Christmas Eve, where was Silver Heels, because she hadn't come into the main part of Buckskin Joe to join the dance or the festivities. They found her cabin abandoned, and Silver Heels was gone. So as a gesture of thanks, the miners named a mountain after her, so that's Mount Silver Heels, down in that area now, okay? So Buckskin Joe, though, it's got a cool cemetery if you're ever over there. The Forest Service has little wagon wheels with numbers, so it is actually worth driving around and like looking at all the markers. But Buckskin Joe wasn't really what would you call an up-and-up place. Gambling was rigged. Gambling was rigged in Denver a lot too. Ed Chase was one of the few people who ran straight games, and he actually sat with a rifle across his knees to make sure that the games were straight and no funny businesses going on. But Buckskin Joe wasn't of that caliber. Buckskin Joe was like, the rest of the state, just whatever you could get away with, go for it, right? And so, over time, people said it was fair play, and the reason why they chose the name Fair Play was because they wanted it to be the antithesis of Buckskin Joe. So they said, well, we're going to name it Fair Play. So that's how they got that name. Just in case you were wondering, why is Fair Play called Fair Play, which is now South Park fame. So, but anyhow, so Feminine Company from Silver Heels and all her sisters, they provided entertainment, right? So they provided different kinds of entertainment. They had dancing, they had theater, and then they had the more basic needs, shall we say. So here is a picture from Ben Loeb's Dance Hall in Leadville. This is a contemporary drawing, and they're having like some sort of fandango going on. Looks like a really good time. Okay. This is a dance hall girl. Now, unfortunately, I don't know where I got that picture from, so that's not from Denver Public Library. But this is like what I imagined when I started off wanting to write a book about like the brothels in Colorado. This is how I thought they were dressed. So I wanted them to have like plumes in their hair and be wearing red silk dresses and have spangles and just like be Miss Kitty in Dodge City, right? That's not how they came, that's not how they dressed. They dressed in kind of like those, they're called Mother Hubbard gowns. They're kind of like those Lawrence of Austria nightgowns. They come up to here, they go down to your floor, they're long sleeve, they're not the same. The dance girls were actually the more glamorous of all these ladies, right? And here's a picture of one. So, out of a book from Saloons of the Old West, written by Richard Erdos, he found 2 newspaper articles that he did not annotate very well, but I still wanted to use them because I just think they're worded so well for this concept. One at 50 waiter girls. High wages, easy work, pay in gold promptly every week, must appear in short clothes or no engagement. Okay, these are the days when people's clothes, their dresses went all the way to the ground. And another account, good steppers, make yourself some money. Fun galore, fine clothing, nothing untoward, which could tend to affect a lady's sensibilities allowed at the Gold Nugget Saloon. Right. So these are still going to be on State Street, where you've got that one alley called Tiger Alley. You've got Stillborn Alley on the other side. And you've got all these cribs and brothels, saloons, and gaming parlors going right through the middle of it. So I think probably women would get offended somewhere along that line. Here is the old saloon and dance hall in Buckskin Joe. So that's like out of the Silver Hills story. That building is no longer there. This picture, I think, was taken about 1954. So unfortunately, it is not there. I think maybe it has a marker. So with the entertaining women, I guess I'll call them that, there was a strict hierarchy in working women, or say women facing the public in an entertainment capacity. I guess that's kind of it. A beer hall girl lady, I think they were called girls, she served beer and maybe a bit else, but maybe not. So if you were a guy with a beer hall girl, you want to proceed with tact, okay? Then a dance hall girl really depends on the establishment. Gold Nugget Saloon aside, most girls would have been very insulted to be confused with a common prostitute. They would earn money by the dance, and they earned a portion of the proceeds of the drinks sold. Depending on the establishment, there might be more on offer for the right price, probably off to the side or out back, okay? One thing that is interesting, most of the dance hall girls, ladies, were known by their real names. So they weren't hiding anything from their parents, they weren't hiding anything necessarily from their relatives, you know, like I'd be going, hi, my name's Randy, you know. So they were known by their own names. Now the actress group depends on the woman. We had some really fine actresses come through Denver, and then we had some people, and I'll show you a photograph of one that is probably not so fine. So I'll show you the picture of the Colorado actress, and those quotes are intentional. Then we had the full-on prostitutes or nymph prostitutes. They had all sorts of names: Heritage, Sylph, Hussy, Nymph du Pab, other French names. The French were actually considered the best, and they really hated the American prostitutes because the American prostitutes tended to be drunk and sloppy all the time, and the French had a little bit more class and were drunk. So Parlor House would be the top of the line, and those girls would probably make, say, $25 an encounter. You do have the Homestead House in Cripple Creek, where they insist they were getting $250 an encounter per prostitute. That is so astronomical, I don't even know how to address that one. I just don't believe it. I think it's good publicity, but like $24 times 250, somebody who's really good at math, I mean, that's like $300,000, you know. I'm like thinking, wow. I know we had a lot of money flowing around, but that kind of pushed the envelope. A brothel, the girl there in, say, Leadville or Denver would earn about $5 to $10, depending on desirability. A crib, then you go into the cribs. These are your independent contractors of the day. A wealthier one or a more successful one would have 2 rooms, a front room to receive the gentleman caller and a bedroom in the back. A 1-room crib, I mean, that woman's kind of going downhill a little bit, so she's just got 1 room, and that's where she lives and she plies her trade. And then you got the hovel cribs, really bad, called the Blue Row in Denver. Everybody kind of had one, and there are accounts there of women reportedly earning 10 cents.